In part 6 of the series, we learned about King Solomon. Solomon was a very interesting king. From him, we saw the heights of Israel and how Elohim established his great name and Israel's name amongst the other nations. But right after the rise, we saw the reason for the fall. Israel did not see the result of his mistakes until after his death, but Elohim prophesied and foretold what was to come. A theme you should have noticed from this series by now is that Elohim keeps his word. So we're now at the fall of Israel. Throughout the next 2 parts, you will hear 2 constant themes: a king who did right in the eyes of Elohim, and kings who did not do right. You'll hear more of the latter, unfortunately. I find that this part of the Bible is not taught at the level it should be. The history directly helps us understand multiple points. The most important point is why Elohim preserved David in Jerusalem to send forth the Messiah. It shows why Israel expected a different type of Savior than what Yahshua was. And lastly, this history shows the significance of the curses of Deuteronomy Chapter 28, because you'll see specifically that Israel did not follow Elohim as they were commanded. The main thing I want to emphasize is that Elohim is loving and understanding and gives us many chances. Israel kept messing up. Then he sometimes scolded them, and he also gave them a chance to fix their mistakes. They continuously made bad choices and later suffered greatly for them. It's the same thing we face in our lives today. We continually sin and provoke Elohim to anger, but he gives us grace and forgives us. But he does sometimes scold and reprimand us. Use these lessons to gain more appreciation, understanding, trust, and love for Elohim. Let's begin. So we ended part 6 with King Solomon and his transgressions against Elohim. He sinned massively, creating confusion and setting a table for Satan to take advantage. Elohim told Solomon he would not remove him as king, and he would preserve the care of Jerusalem with Judah for David's sake. So the changes in the kingdom of Israel did not occur until Solomon's death. Solomon was king of Israel for 40 years. Before his end, Jeroboam, a servant of Solomon from the tribe of Ephraim, was met by the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah took a piece of his clothing and tore it to 12 pieces. He told Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, and thus says Yahweh, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you, and he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because Israel has forsaken me. And Solomon did not do right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judges, as did his father. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I've made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David. But I will take the kingdom out of his sons, and give it to you 10 tribes, and to Solomon I will give 1 tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself to put my name there. So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart's desire, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight as my servant David, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house." Solomon knew about this and tried to kill Jeroboam. So Jeroboam fled to Egypt. So Solomon later died, and his son Rehoboam was now going to be king. His son Rehoboam went to a city in Israel to be crowned king, and all of Israel, including Jeroboam, went for the crowning. After being made king, the leaders of Israel spoke to Rehoboam and said, "Your father Solomon made our burden heavy. Will you not lighten the load of service required of your father, and we will serve you?" Rehoboam spoke to the elders, and they told him, "If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." He rejected that advice, though, and consulted also with his friends he grew up with, and they told him, "Make their burdens heavier," and that was the advice he listened to. Rehoboam went back to Israel and told them, "My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist, and now as my father put a heavy burden on you, I will add to that burden. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges." When all of Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, they said, "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. And from this, Israel was in rebellion against the house of David or Judah to this day. There was no more united kingdom of the 12 tribes. Israel made Jeroboam king. He reigned over the northern 10 tribes, and Rehoboam was king over Judah and Benjamin. The capital of Judah was Jerusalem, and the capital of Israel was Samaria. Rehoboam wanted to start a war, but Elohim did not let him. So we are now at a point of a divided kingdom, consisting of many different kings of both Israel and Judah. There's a lot of history amongst these kings, but for time purposes, I will not go over all the details. If you want more details, you can read about this all in 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles. So we have King Jeroboam of Israel and King Rehoboam of Judah. Jeroboam did not trust in Elohim and built his own shrines and high places. He made 2 calves of gold and told the people, "Since it's too much to go to Jerusalem, here are your gods. They can be worshipped in Bethel and one in Dan." He made priests from every class of people, not just from the sons of Levi. He did evil in the sight of Elohim. King Rehoboam did evil as well. He did not prepare his heart to seek Elohim. Judah provoked Elohim to jealousy by serving other gods. They built them in high places, sacred pillars, and wooden images on every high hill. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which Elohim had cast up before Israel. Both kings did evil in the sight of Elohim. And this continued down the line of kings. Some did good in the sight of Elohim, and many did evil in his sight. Let's follow this chart. You can see from this chart the kings that served Elohim and the ones that did evil in the sight of Elohim. Like I said, if you want specifics on each king, I do recommend you reading 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as 2nd Chronicles. The history is quite interesting. 2nd Chronicles is literally just another account of what you'll find in 1st and 2nd Kings. Some have different details than others, but this is the history of ancient Israel, and it must be understood. If you want a copy of this chart, I will have it on my website for you. The link to it is in the description. So let's understand a few things from this. The first thing to understand is the kings of Israel. All the 10 northern tribes did a lot of evil. They all were found evil in the sight of Elohim. Each one seemed to be exceedingly more wicked than the next. The worst one seemed to be King Ahab. He was horrible because he had help. He took Jezebel, a daughter of the king of the Sidonians, as his wife. And together they set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Jezebel herself massacred prophets of Elohim. She was just killing prophets and establishing prophets of Baal. This is where we become introduced to the prophet Elijah. Elijah was labeled a troubler of Israel because he spoke overzealously against the wickedness in Israel. He went to meet King Ahab even though Ahab was looking to kill him. Elijah told King Ahab, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of Elohim and followed Baal. Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, as well as the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who all eat at Jezebel's table." Ahab agreed and did so. Elijah came to all the people and said, "How long will you falter between two opinions? If Elohim is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. I alone am left a prophet of Elohim, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So here's what we'll do. Let them give us 2 bulls. Let Baal's prophets choose 1 bull, cut it into pieces, and lay it on wood, but put no fire under it. I will do the same with my bull. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I'll call on the name of Elohim. The God who answers by fire, he is God." So they took the challenge. The prophets of Baal prepared the bull, called on the name of Baal from morning to noon, saying, "O Baal, hear us." But there was no voice. No one answered. Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry louder, for he is God, right? Either he's meditating, or he's busy, or maybe he's on a journey, or maybe he's sleeping, and he must be awakened." So they cried louder, cut themselves until blood gushed out, as is their custom in the world of all devil worship, but no one answered. So it was Elijah's turn. Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of sons of Jacob. Then he built an altar in the name of Elohim. He put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah said, O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I'm your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Elohim. Hear me, that this people may know that you are God, and that you have turned their heart back to you again. Then the fire of Elohim fell and consumed the burnt sacrifices. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, Elohim, he is God. Elohim, he is God. Elijah then said, Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. And so they seized them. Elijah brought them down to the brook and executed them. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had executed all the prophets. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah and said, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time. So Elijah went and hid in a cave. Elohim came to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah said, I have been very zealous for you, Elohim, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Elohim told him, Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha as prophet in your place. It shall be whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elohim also told Elijah, in reference to Jezebel, On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be refused on the surface of the field, in the plot at Jezreel. So they shall not say, Here lies Jezebel. So all of this was done. Ahab's complete line was destroyed, and Jehu became king over Israel. Jehu found Jezebel, and she was killed. Her flesh was eaten by dogs, nothing to bury. And remember, she asked for it. Elisha was made a prophet to replace Elijah. As they were both walking, Elohim called up Elijah to heaven. Another example of Elohim preserving those loyal to him. Now Jezebel is important to understand. This Jezebel spirit is a wicked one. She is notoriously known for being the greatest enemy of the prophets of Israel. According to Kim Daniel's Demon Dictionary, Jezebel is a spirit that operates by absolute power. Control and manipulation are at its foundation. All that was left of Jezebel after the dogs devoured her were her hands, feet, and skull. Her hands represent stopping the work of Elohim in our lives. Her feet represent being demonically led by her. And her skull represents mind control. She is overly controlling, and you will often see that spirit manifest to drive people away from Elohim. There is also the Ahab spirit. This is a spirit that comes upon leadership to cause them to walk in the ways of the ungodly, and to turn the hearts of the people towards idolatry. This spirit not only puts up with the Jezebel, but is also in total agreement with and works with the Jezebel spirit. You should beware of these spirits. Do not go against these spirits without understanding spiritual warfare. I will devote some teaching to this. I explained this part of the story because it's important to understand Elijah and just the extent to how wicked Israel was. They were worshiping Baal. Elijah is important to understand because he was one of the boldest prophets. In a very wicked time where it seemed all the northern tribes worshiped Baal, Elijah took belief in Elohim and challenged all of Baal's prophets, all the way to a point where he was hunted. If you parallel that to these times, I hope his story gives you strength. We are again in a very wicked time. It seems everyone practices some form of Baal worship. But if this video does anything, I hope that it builds up a bunch of Elijahs, men and women confident in the God they serve and ready to stand up against the Baals. Elijah was protected, and you are too, if you put your trust in him. Elohim took care of him because he was loyal to Elohim. His heart was good. I pray that strengthens you to ask Elohim for protection because of your overzealousness for him and your intolerance for Baal. Preach the good news and expose wickedness. But there's so much to this part in the story, I had to split the information up. The points you need to understand from this part are: 1. Because of Solomon's sins, the kingdom of Israel was taken from his line. 2. The 10 northern tribes split and were now known as Israel. 3. Judah and Benjamin were only known as Judah, and it was preserved because of Elohim's covenant with David and him choosing Jerusalem as his city. 4. The kings of Israel all did evil in the sight of Elohim and worshiped Baal. 5. Elijah, a prophet, stood for Elohim, challenged the prophets of Baal, and won, later executing the prophets. 6. Elijah was called up to heaven for his obedience. Part 8 will continue with this story because there's much more to understand. I hope this summary gives you good information and encourages you to read all of this on your own. This is truly remarkable information. This is pure history, and if people just knew this history, I feel it would directly defeat many people's stumbling block in their belief. But what I pray for most is that what it has done is raise up bold Elijahs prepared to be overzealous for Elohim and plead the blood of Yahshua over everything in their lives. Thanks for watching. I love you all. In the last part of my series, part 7, we saw the split between Israel and Judah. Because of King Solomon's sins, Elohim split up the kingdom of Israel. The northern 10 tribes split up from Judah and Benjamin, and there now was a divided kingdom. As you will see from this part, the united kingdom of Israel was never seen again. The children of Israel did not obey the covenant they had with Elohim, and what we are witnessing at this point of the story is what happens at the point of disobedience and rebellion against Elohim. There are many different points to take into consideration from understanding this part. What I want to be emphasized above all is the consequences of our sin. When you review the information from all these series, the one thing that should be abundantly clear is that Elohim loves us. He continues to give us chance after chance. The point that needs to be clear is that he never just moves against his people without warning. Throughout this history of Israel, there are many different prophets that Elohim spoke through, and they spoke very intensely against sin. They spoke in urgency for Israel and Judah to come back to the covenant their fathers made with Elohim. But they ignored it and later paid the price for it. As you understand this history, please make sure you examine this within your own life. Has Elohim been trying to connect with you? Are you rejecting parts of his word? Are you being lukewarm? I'm not a prophet, but I do know the urgency of today, and I ask that you parallel the lessons that you learn from this part in this series with your own life, making sure you do not repeat the mistakes of Israel and mocking the many warnings Elohim has been giving you. Let's begin. So we left with the end of the rule of Ahab and Jezebel. We also saw Elijah being caught up to heaven for his zeal for Elohim. This time period was in the middle of the reign of kings of both Israel and Judah. Again, this chart is on my website for you to review. The link is in the description below. The northern 10 tribes never got the point that they were to serve Elohim. Jehu was appointed king over Israel. He removed all who remained loyal to Ahab in Samaria. Jehu gathered all of Israel together and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little. Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore, call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants, and all his priests. Let no one be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu acted deceptively, with the intent of destroying the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu said, Proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. All the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. So they came into the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was full. Jehu went into the temple of Baal and said to the worshippers of Baal, Search and see that no servants of Yahweh are here with you, but only the worshippers of Baal. So they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had appointed for himself 80 men on the outside, and had said, If any of the men whom I have brought into your hand escapes, whoever lets him escape, it shall be his life for the life of the other. When he ended the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, Go in and kill them, let no one come out. And they killed them with the edge of the sword. Then the guards and the officers threw them out and went into the inner room of the temple of Baal. They broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal. Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. Elohim even spoke to him and told him, "Because you have done well in doing what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your sons shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation." But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, with all his heart, for he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin. Elohim let Jehu's sons reign up to the 4th generation, as was his word to Jehu. All of Jehu's sons continued in the sin of Jeroboam. Remember, Jeroboam was the first king when Israel split from Judah. He set the tone of sin for those in the northern 10 tribes, and as we go down the list of these kings of Israel, they all did evil in the sight of Elohim and caused Israel to sin greatly. During these times, there were prophets that continuously pleaded with Israel to turn away from their sins. The Old Testament is filled with history, but it also has books written by many of these prophets that were spoken to by Elohim to go back to the people and warn them of their sins. In Israel, the prophets were Ahijah, Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. They all were given a word from Elohim to warn Israel of their sins. Israel was continuously warned that they were provoking Elohim to anger. Elohim continued to send out men to warn his children, but their hearts were far from him, so they did not heed the warnings. I don't know about you, but it sounds an awful lot like today. Elohim has placed urgency and warnings in so many of his children. Many of us give it out to whomever will hear it, but sometimes it feels like it falls on deaf ears. One day, those warnings will be old, and it will be too late, just like what happens next to Israel. Israel was rebellious through all the different kings they had. They all did evil in the sight of Elohim. Elohim eventually removed his protection against Israel, and they were overtaken by Assyria. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. The king of Assyria then took the people of Israel captive and removed them out of their lands. You can read this specifically in 2 Kings chapter 17. Elohim rejected all the descendants of Israel. He afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of the plunderers until he had cast Israel from his sight, as he has said by all his servants, the prophets. The children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They never departed from them. Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria and did not return back to the land. The land of the northern 10 tribes was captured and conquered. The king of Assyria brought people from other nations like Babylon to dwell in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. These nations feared Elohim, but they did not serve him, and they defiled the land. Israel never reclaimed his land again. The 10 northern tribes were scattered and lost. This is where we get the 10 lost tribes of Israel. All the tribes of Israel besides Judah and Benjamin were lost. They were captured and then scattered. The one thing we know for sure about them, without a doubt, is that Elohim is not through with them yet. According to Revelation chapter 7, there will be 12,000 from each of those 10 tribes that will be sealed, all except the tribe of Dan, which I discussed briefly in part 3. But this is the story of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. To read the end of this story yourself, again, you can find it in 2 Kings chapter 17. So now we're back to Judah. If you go back to the chart, Judah was mixed. There were good kings and there were bad kings. They lasted longer than the northern 10 tribes did because some of the kings of Judah sought after Elohim. One of those kings was Hezekiah. In his first year of reign, he reopened the doors of the temple. He spoke to the Levites and said, "Now sanctify yourselves. Sanctify the house of Elohim, the God of your fathers, and carry out the rubbish from the holy place. For our fathers have trespassed and done evil in the eyes of Yahweh, our Elohim. They have forsaken him. They have turned their faces away from the dwelling place of Yahweh and turned their backs on him. Therefore the wrath of Yahweh fell upon Judah and Jerusalem, and he has given them up to trouble, to desolation, and to jeering, as you see with your own eyes. For indeed, because of this, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, that his fierce wrath may turn away from us." Later on, in Hezekiah's reign, after Israel was overtaken and defeated, another king of Assyria, King Sennacherib, came and entered Judah. He set up camp against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself. Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem. he took certain precautions and told his military captains, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor before all the multitude that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an army of flesh, but with us is Yahweh, our Elohim, to help us and to fight our battles." And the people were strengthened by the words of Hezekiah. Sennacherib sent his servants to Jerusalem with a word to Hezekiah and all of Judah, saying, "Thus says Sennacherib, king of Assyria, in what do you trust that you remain under siege of Jerusalem? Does Hezekiah not persuade you to give yourselves over to die by famine and by thirst, saying the Elohim will deliver us from the hand of the king of Assyria? Has not the same Hezekiah taken away his high places and his altars, and commanded Judah and Jerusalem, saying, you shall worship before one altar and burn incense on it? Do you not know what I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of other lands? Were the gods of the nations of those lands in any way able to deliver their lands out of my hand? Who was there among all the gods of those nations that my fathers utterly destroyed that could deliver his people from my hand, that your God should be able to deliver you from my hand? Now therefore, do not let Hezekiah deceive you or persuade you like this, and do not believe him. For no God of any nation or kingdom was able to deliver his people from my hand or the hand of my fathers. How much less will your God deliver you from my hand? Furthermore, his servants spoke against Elohim and against his servant Hezekiah. He also wrote letters to revile Elohim, speaking against him, saying, as the gods of the nations of other lands have not delivered their people from my hand, so the God of Hezekiah will not deliver his people from my hand. Hezekiah sent out to the prophet Isaiah to hear the word he had from Elohim. Isaiah said to the people he sent, thus you shall say to your master, thus says Yahweh, do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Surely I will send a spirit upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Isaiah sent to King Hezekiah a word saying, thus says Yahweh, because you have prayed to me against Sennacherib king of Assyria, I have heard. Therefore, thus says Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor build a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and he shall not come into this city, says Yahweh, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So in the end, Yahweh sent an angel, which cut off all the mighty men of valor and the leaders and captains in the camp of the king of Assyria. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, returned with shame to his own land. And when he went into the house of his God, his own brothers killed him there with the sword. He went against Judah without being authorized by Elohim to do so. Another lesson on the power of Elohim. But Hezekiah was a good king, and ended that way. And Judah then had a few more kings. King Josiah was the last good one. After him, the kings of Judah continued to do evil in the sight of Elohim. And like Israel, there were prophets that spoke warnings against the wickedness of Judah and what Elohim would do. The prophets of Judah were Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. They all had messages and warnings. And if you take these prophets along with the prophets of Israel, you have many of the other books that make up the Old Testament. There were many different prophecies. Many were specifically about the coming Messiah. I will explain them and cover them in a future part of the series. But in regard to this subject, Elohim sent warnings to Judah by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of Elohim, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh arose against his people, till there was no remedy. He brought against them Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who killed the young men of Judah with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young men or virgins, on the aged or the weak. Elohim gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of Elohim, great and small, the treasures of the temple, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned the temple, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword were carried away to Babylon, where they became servants. This is the first time the temple had been destroyed. It's important to note that. The kingdom of ancient Israel was destroyed. Now this may sound like the end, but it definitely was not. There was prophecy from Jeremiah that foretold that this would happen, as well as how long they would remain in captivity. Elohim preserved Judah like he said he would. He did all this in order to establish his new covenant and keep the promise he made to Abraham. But all of this is the history of ancient Israel. The points you need to understand are: 1. The northern 10 tribes of Israel continue to be disobedient to Elohim. 2. Because of their disobedience, they were overtaken by Assyria. 3. They are referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. 4. Judah had good kings that kept them in favor with Elohim. 5. They eventually continued to rebel against Elohim. 6. They were overtaken by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. 7. Both Israel and Judah were given many warnings by prophets and messengers sent by Elohim. You won't hear any more about the northern 10 tribes. The rest of this story will deal with Judah. We are getting close to the Messiah, and I'm very excited about that. The next part of this series, we will see what happened to Judah while in and out of captivity. I hope this blessed you and opens your eyes and hearts to Elohim. He loves us all very much. He has given us much grace, but the time of grace is running out. Do not be like Israel and Judah, who has heard the word from many different prophets and messengers speaking of the urgency of today, and you do not heed the warnings. I know it can be confusing because it seems everyone wants to claim to be a prophet. I do not claim to be a prophet at all, but I do know he has placed a message in me to tell all to bring all thoughts into captivity of the obedience of the Messiah, Yahshua. Put down all idols and any conformity to this world. Follow Elohim with your full hearts. He has given us the Comforter, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, as a gift to all that receive it, so that we can walk with him personally. We do not need anyone else to intervene to allow us to be close with him. He is our Emmanuel, meaning Elohim in us. Seek him fervently and diligently. There is no better time than today. His love and grace is for all who accepts it. Use Israel and Judah as an example not to play with Elohim. He promised them horrible curses, curses that they're still under today. And while those curses are horrible while living on earth, the penalty for not accepting Yahshua are much more severe. Accept him today and turn from the wickedness of this world. I hope that reached whoever it was for. Again, if you like this video, please give it a like and share it with others. If it has blessed you, please make sure you're subscribed. I thank you for your support. I love you all.